Hey everybody, I'm Tim Mooney with the Timothy Mooney Repertory Theater, author, performer of the Breakneck Shakespeare series, which you can find at breakneckshakespeare.com. It's been a while since I've posted one of these, largely because this one demanded a lot of extra attention. But I'm back with my latest, I Finally Get Henry VI, Part 1. First, quick shout out to the late Isaac Asimov, whose book, Asimov's Guide to Shakespeare, unfortunately now out of print, is my main resource for this material. Let me start by saying that Henry VI Part 1 is Shakespeare's worst play. Well, it's his worst play if we assume that it is actually a play of his, or at least of whomever was writing under the pen name of Shakespeare back then. If Shakespeare wrote this one, it predates almost all of the 38 or so plays that he eventually did write. As such, we probably shouldn't be surprised that it's bad, but this is like epic bad. It's bad to a spectacular degree. Not even so much for the writing itself, which is no great shakes, if you know what I mean. It's historically bad. Which is not to say that it's the worst play in history, but that it gets history so very totally mangled and wrong, which Shakespeare just tends not to do, unless maybe he has to paper over the misdeeds of some of Queen Elizabeth's ancestors, which he's totally up for when necessary. This play gets all of its dates messed up incorrect. Just out of curiosity, here's a glance at the historical order in which the events of Shakespeare's history plays happen. There's 10 of these plays, and you can see Henry VI, Part 1, right there in the middle, more or less. A span of time predating Shakespeare's writing by about 170 years. He started writing this epic cycle somewhere in the middle, writing the 4 plays that cover the War of the Roses, before doubling back to King John 390 years prior to write the stories that predate this first, less than perfect play. Henry VI was perhaps one of, if not the weakest king in English history. He became king while still an infant, and his rule was in turmoil throughout, as factions worked to control him, and as potential successors attempted to usurp his rule and occasionally succeeded in doing so. And so this was near enough in the past that the historical memory was still relatively fresh, with wounds not entirely healed. Moreover, Shakespeare, or whomever wrote this play, was still a little green in the area of research. And by green, I mean he was largely, excuse my French, making merde up. In all of Shakespeare's history plays, there are omissions, contractions of time, and some reassignment of roles, but almost always for some dramatic purpose. Of course, Shakespeare would mature significantly as a playwright and a historian as he wrote, but the differences, even moving from Henry VI Part 1 to Henry VI Part 2, are so significant that most have come to the conclusion that the conception and construction of Henry VI Part 1 were at the hand of another writer, and Shakespeare, perhaps in the course of writing Parts 2 and 3, reached back into somebody else's work to clean up a tiny bit of the hash that this other playwright had made of history, and or to make it better align with the themes he was planning to take up. The biggest challenge for Shakespeare, or whomever, in writing a play about Henry VI is that Shakespeare has to examine how England went from one of the most successful campaigns in its history, the success of Henry V at Agincourt, more info on him here, to what was to turn into an ultimate disaster. And he has to do that without offending Queen Elizabeth, whose ancestry featured some of these same characters. First of all, when this play opens, amid the eulogies to Henry V, Henry VI is just shy of 9 months old. And when a 9-month-old takes the throne, he is in absolutely no way capable of taking over the country. Shakespeare forces this child to grow up awfully quickly, if we go by actual time. But more important to this story are the factions that immediately dot the landscape surrounding an incapable king at such a time when they probably should have been handling issues abroad, like the war in France. Those factions fall into two major categories. First, there are those who were looking to fill the vacuum of power, all of whom were uncles of one kind or another. There were two immediate direct uncles who were brothers of the king's now dead father. These were John, Duke of Bedford, who was mostly off dealing with the occupation of France, and his younger brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who became the Lord Protector, making all of the kingly decisions while the actual king ever so gradually grew into his long pants. There were also the two slightly more distant granduncles, who were half-brothers of Henry IV. Henry IV's father, John of Gaunt, fathered what were unfortunately known as bastard sons. Bastards, at least until such time that John of Gaunt married the boy's mother, Catherine, thus legitimizing those children. Of course, those children would always struggle for true legitimacy in any fight for the throne, A, because they started out as bastards, and B, because they were younger. And as long as there were any descendants from Gaunt's first wife, Blanche, that second group born to Catherine would always play second fiddle. Of course, that situation is always a little bit flexible, and a 9-month-old heir had no guarantee of living long enough to father some other heir to the throne. There are two sets of 3 brothers, and the eldest of both sets is already dead when this play begins. The granduncles are the Beaufort faction, 3 sons who included John, the Earl of Somerset, now dead, Henry, the Bishop of Winchester, and Thomas, the Duke of Exeter. While John is already dead, he left behind that second set of 3 sons, since John was the first of this bastard fraternity. If the Somerset line ever came into contention, the crown would pass to one of these sons of Somerset, rather than the second or third brother of Somerset, by the laws of primogeniture. The law of primogeniture essentially says the eldest son gets it all, which is also why there's a 9-month-old currently reigning as king. Your understanding of Shakespeare essentially doubles when you fully grasp the law of primogeniture. The eldest son gets it all, which meant that the 2 brothers of Somerset had no actual path to the throne for themselves, and could only fight to be power vacuum fillers, not kings. These surviving 2 sons of Gaunt had a similar divide, with Henry, Bishop of Winchester, staying at home, more or less, with King Henry, and with Thomas, the Duke of Exeter, mostly abroad, engaged in the wars in France. So, once more, 2 direct uncles, Humphrey of Gloucester at home, John of Bedford away at war, and 2 grand half-uncles, the Bishop of Winchester at home and Thomas of Exeter away. These 4 men are bickering from the very opening and will pretty much keep at it throughout. But keep in mind, none of them can be king. Then we come to the next group of what I call king hopefuls. These include the Duke of York, currently known as Richard Plantagenet, a complicated character who I'll come back to, and the Duke of Somerset. It may help to think of these 2 as kind of hoping to stumble their way into the kingship. They probably wouldn't dare to kill their cousin to become king, but they might not mind if he had some kind of accident. Shakespeare is exceedingly vague about whether Somerset is the second or third son of John Beaufort, the Earl of Somerset. Remember, the first son, Henry, died before Henry VI was born, so probably nothing that happens in this play is about him. And yet, Shakespeare has the character of Somerset as, to use Isaac Asimov's word, an amalgam of perhaps all 3 of the sons of Beaufort, because no one of them could be alive or in town for all of the events that Shakespeare has this single character working through. Believe me, if you try to trace down who would or would not have been able to do all of these things and when and how, you will lose the entire thread. That way, madness lies. With that said, I'm going to try. If I'm a little loopy by the end of this video, you'll know why. This play is totally wrapped up with one important question. How could the English possibly lose to the French? Following King Henry V's astonishing victory over the French at Agincourt, even though outnumbered 5-1, there was a general sense that no amount of French opposition could stop the much stronger, cleverer, and valiant English army. Shakespeare, or whomever, generally reaches for two answers. One, they got caught up in petty squabbles amongst themselves, and two, the French used witchcraft. So the play opens, and Henry's uncles and grand half-uncles are already squabbling about just how he died. Some form of treachery, the church praying for his death, internal strife. He really died of dysentery, but let's not let that get in the way of a good conspiracy theory. A messenger arrives with news of sudden losses in France, reeling off a list of 7 cities. You really don't want to hear my tortured mix of French-English pronunciation, so I'll only speak them aloud if I absolutely have to. Almost as if the moment that Henry V kicked the bucket, all those cities reared up at once, asserting themselves. Even this play is not consistent with that notion. The struggle for Orléans, or in the United States, Orleans, alone will occupy a massive portion of the action. Orléans will not fall for 7 years yet, and Paris, or Paris, 12 years later in 1437. While the author never really indicates this, the only way to take this litany of lost cities is not to think of it literally, but as a metaphor, or as a sort of a dumb show prologue that they used to throw into these plays. It's an early overview of what is going to happen, not a report of what actually did already happen. What did happen in 1422 is that the French Dauphin, the equivalent of the Prince of Wales in England, i.e. the next in line for the crown, was crowned King Charles VII in Poitiers. As we will discover, crowning in Poitiers does not count. It wasn't until he was crowned in Reims in 1429 that he was fully regarded by the French, at least, as King Charles VII. Another messenger arrives with news of another heroic battle in which the English, outnumbered by 4-1, were beaten by the French. In truth, the great hero of this play, John Talbot, amid a retreat from Orléans, blustered his way into an unnecessary fight to lash back at the French for raising the siege of Orléans, getting himself wounded and captured in the process. This battle was actually 7 years after Henry V's funeral, not in August 1422, but in June 1429. And the English were not outnumbered 4-1, more like 4-3. Shakespeare cannot allow any English loss to be by anything but against overwhelming odds, or witchcraft. Even though the messenger just described the loss of Orléans, which was really the raising of the English siege, when the scene moves back to France, we are back in Orléans and the siege is still going on. Joan of Arc arrives at Orléans to find the Dauphin. In actuality, she really met him in Chinon, some 90 miles southwest at the time. Shakespeare has Joan defeating the Dauphin in a duel. She was, in fact, questioned by church authorities for a month before even being allowed to see the Dauphin, who more likely recognized that her natural charisma might well inspire the troops on the field rather than letting her attack him with a weapon. Shakespeare has Talbot returning to the siege of Orléans, just as Salisbury, the English commander, is shot and ultimately killed. In actual chronology, Salisbury was shot in October and died in November 1428. Joan of Arc arrived not in Orleans, but in Chinon in February 1429 and didn't continue on to break the siege of Orleans until months after that. And it wasn't until June 1429 that Talbot was even captured in the first place, as described in that previous, now forgotten retreat from Orleans. He was not released until 4 years later in 1433. We seem to be caught in a time loop here. Act 2. Shakespeare depicts Talbot in combat with Joan, and she defeats him, which only manages to demonstrate that she is clearly a witch. While Joan of Arc may have led the French forces clad in armor, she never actually fought in battle. Shakespeare proceeds to invent an English victory out of whole cloth, in which the French, amid a celebration of their own victory, are surprised late at night and forced to flee Orleans, humiliated and in their nightclothes. In reality, though, this stretch of time, the French were driving the English backwards as they pushed 140 miles to the northwest to have Charles the Dauphin crowned as King Charles VII in Reims, the traditional ceremonial place of French coronation. While the English had possessed Reims for a time, they never quite got around to having the toddler Henry VI crowned there before it was lost to the French, and he was only crowned as an afterthought of sorts in Paris in 1430. Paris doesn't count either. The English forces were losing one battle after another, retreating and retreating, while Shakespeare largely depicts victories. Somehow, they're winning and winning, even as the front line of engagement is moving in reverse in a northeasterly direction. And even as they are moving northeast, Talbot receives an invitation from the Countess of Auvergne for an intimate rendezvous back in her castle, 150 miles south, deep in enemy territory. The whole love affair was, of course, a ruse to capture Talbot. But when the Countess calls for her officers, Talbot calls for the soldiers that he wisely brought along as his wingmen, and the Countess falls into a rapture over Talbot's great daring do. At last, we finally get a scene of historical relevance and dramatic consequence. This one almost certainly written by Shakespeare, even though it never happened like this in reality. There is a scene in an English garden where Richard Plantagenet, who would soon inherit his grandfather's title as Richard of York, his father was executed as a traitor to Henry V, so the title was lost to the family for a while, gathers with a group of lords who have withdrawn to the garden from a meeting that has gotten hung up on a point of law that is never articulated in the scene itself. The point of the argument is never spoken aloud, though it clearly deals with issues of royal succession. Here's my best guess at the argument that drove them from their formal indoors meeting out into the garden. This is the sort of thing that an average educated Englishman would probably know back then, about as well as we know about Abraham Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, or Harriet Tubman. Way back in the play Richard II, Henry Bolingbroke usurped his cousin Richard to place himself on the throne as Henry IV. Richard was descended from the very first son of Edward III, while Henry was descended by way of the fourth son, John of Gaunt. In the midst of a violent takeover led by Henry Bolingbroke, wrenching the crown away from his cousin, few gave consideration to the fact that Edward III did have a third son, Lionel. Lionel fathered a girl, Philippa, who married Edmund Mortimer, the third Earl of March, and gave birth to Roger Mortimer, the fourth Earl of March. Roger had a daughter, Anne, who married Richard the Earl of Cambridge, who was descended from Edward III's fifth son. Yes, and you thought that it was only the Giuliani family that intermarried. Those two semi-distant cousins parented Richard Plantagenet. So, Richard Plantagenet is descended from both the third and the fifth sons of Edward III, whereas Henry VI, the current king, is only descended by way of the fourth son, John of Gaunt. Unfortunately, Richard's descent on the Lionel side, the third son of Edward III, passed through a daughter of third son Lionel and the daughter of Roger, the fourth Earl of March. These maternal links to the third son would seem to be a deal killer, were it not for the fact that the great Henry V, grandson of John of Gaunt, had fought the greatest battle of all English history, predicated on the fact that his great-grandfather Edward III was the son born of a marriage between an English king and a French princess. The French insisted that only the descendants of a male heir to the French throne counted, and after much tortured legalese, which you can read all about at the beginning of Shakespeare's Henry V, Henry, the greatest, most heroic English king, called, if you'll excuse my language, bullshit on that exclusion. And so just about a decade later, the English lords are totally ignoring that same circumstance, assured that York cannot inherit because he is descended by way of the matriarchy and not the patriarchy. Of course, as long as Henry IV and Henry V lived, no one was ever really going to make that case, and even York cannot bring himself to say out loud that he should be king now. That would be treason and a death sentence, whether or not it were true. But he might yet be able to approach this question from an oblique, abstract angle, simply posing the question, might the King of England descend by way of a female line of succession? And while the English monarchy may have largely been a good old boys club of patriarchy, we can't ignore the fact that the current English monarch did not belong to that special fraternity, and Queen Elizabeth would very likely have sympathized with York's side of this argument. And so, York is the great-grandson of a daughter of the third son, while Somerset is a son of the legitimized bastard son of the fourth son. And while no one is going to acknowledge the implications of the answer to this question, should anything happen to the child king Henry VI, who is not due to be anybody's daddy for another dozen years or so, the answer to the question of whether a king may be drawn from the female line of descent is suddenly going to matter very much. And rather than speak any of this out loud, York suggests that through dumb significance, they signify their position on this abstract point of boring legal contention by plucking a rose from the nearby briar, a white rose to symbolize agreement with York's abstract suggestion of a fine point of English law, while Somerset in turn proposes a red rose for those sympathizing with his contrary claim. Since you are tongue-tied and so loath to speak, in dumb significance proclaim your thoughts. Let him that is a true-born gentleman, if he suppose that I have pleaded truth from off this briar, pluck a white rose with me. Various parties pluck varying roses, and the battle lines are drawn. Of course, no scene like this that we know of ever happened in real life. The White Rose of York only developed its symbolic weight in the approaching civil wars, and historians of the following century grasped for a red rose symbol to signify the Somerset faction. Speaking of Somerset, as we have already mentioned, he is descended by way of John Beaufort, who fathered 3 sons and died 10 years before the start of this play. It is the progeny of John who factor into this play, not the first, Henry, already dead, but the second and third, John and Edmund, who each participated in events depicted here. Sometimes Shakespeare depicts John's activities, and sometimes Edmund's. He never clarifies and largely treats them as the same generic Somerset. Maybe they couldn't afford another costume. Did Shakespeare know that they were different people? Not care that they were different people? Or did he just not want to confuse his audience any further than they might already be confused? Unfortunately, Richard Plantagenet has a blot on his family name due to his father, Richard of Cambridge's unfortunate conspiracy to treason, as depicted in Henry V. And yet, Richard himself is due for a promotion at the upcoming next Parliament. It so happens that in order to get to that next Parliament, we need to move back in time to 1426, when King Henry was all of 5 years old, and 2 years before the siege of Orleans that occupied most of Acts 1 and 2 had even begun. As Isaac Asimov comments, it is useless to try to unscramble the hopeless, tangled chronology of this play. Richard Plantagenet, who will soon be Duke of York, visits his uncle Edmund Mortimer, imprisoned in the Tower of London. Shakespeare, or whomever, describes Mortimer as having gray locks, Nestor-like, aged in an age of care. The legends of Nestor are derived from Homer's The Iliad, and sometimes characterize him as living to the ripe old age of 200. We may assume that the author did not quite research thoroughly enough to notice that this Mortimer died in 1425 at the age of 34. It's quite possible that Shakespeare has confused this Mortimer with the earlier Mortimer that was imprisoned by the Welsh back during the play Henry IV Part 1. But even that play confused the Edmund Mortimer of their time with Mortimer's elder brother, Roger, who might have held a legitimate claim to the English throne. But that heir had been dead for 27 years now. There were 3 Edmund Mortimers: grandfather, father, and son. The middle Edmund was the younger brother to Roger. Roger, a legit heir, sandwiched in between 2 other Edmunds who were also legitimate heirs. The middle, younger brother Edmund was never any threat to inherit the crown, but Shakespeare acts as if Roger never existed and that all 3 Edmunds were in play for the crown at one point or another. Or perhaps he decided to act as if all the Edmunds were the same guy to avoid confusion, in which case, yes, Grandpa Edmund might well have been Nestor-like. The dying Edmund is dying with an imaginary chip on his shoulder, complaining that Henry V had kept him locked up in the tower all these years in loathsome sequestration. In point of fact, it was Henry IV who locked Mortimer away, while Henry V freed him, brought him along to battle with him, and gave him a plum assignment in Ireland, where he died in 1425 from the plague and not from old age. In fact, many suggest that it was Edmund Mortimer himself who informed Henry V that Richard of Cambridge, this Richard Plantagenet's father, was conspiring to kill the king. Cambridge was beheaded along with 2 other conspirators. And so, if Richard Plantagenet has an issue with anybody, it is not with Henry V or Henry VI, but maybe that very Edmund Mortimer he's speaking to now, who might have been the snitch. And yet the current Edmund Mortimer, whomever he is, tells the tale of English succession, which, in light of the rose-picking scene in the garden, we assume Richard already knows, in such a way as to bring Richard around to the conclusion, "Methinks my father's execution was nothing less than bloody tyranny." Having delivered that message, Mortimer dies. Richard of Cambridge inherits his estates and becomes the 6th Earl of March as a consequence, and now heads off to the Parliament where he finally inherits that Duke of York title that his beheaded father missed out on. Act 3. Amid that Parliament, Gloucester and Winchester break into violent disagreement over the floundering war in France, and King Henry VI, in his very first speeches in this play, pacifies them in words far more eloquent than one might expect of a 5-year-old. Left behind after the ruckus, Exeter, one of Henry's half-grand uncles, bemoans this divide of the English lords into factions and wishes to not live to see the approaching decline, and was indeed to die in 1427, in advance of the war's great turning point of the 1429 siege of Orleans, which, according to this play, already took place back in Act 1. Side note, if you attend this play in person, you might well come away with the impression that the English and French are fighting to capture and recapture the same castle over and over again. Probably Orleans, since that's the one they start at. This is largely due to the fact that few theaters are able to spring for the design and construction of a half dozen or so castles as the characters crisscross France and England. Shakespeare depicts Joan and the French forces taking the castle at Rouen by means of trickery, dressing up as peasants to sneak inside and surprise the English from within. And yet, Rouen is far to the north of the main fighting in and around Orléans and well to the west of Reims, which the French retook on their campaign to have the Dauphin Charles crowned king. The French didn't retake Rouen until 1449, 18 years after Joan of Arc's death, coincidentally at Rouen, and the treacherous ambush while disguised as peasants stratagem was not a French maneuver, but sounds exactly like something the English forces did in capturing the French town of Évreux in 1441. Yes, Shakespeare is guilty of projection. The growing number of English losses began a serious acceleration with the loss of their alliance with Burgundy in the west of France. Early on, Philip of Burgundy rebelled against the Dauphin, taking up on the English side. It took a fair share of bribery to keep him on board, and John of Bedford even married Philip's sister. But following her, and later John's death, Burgundy pushed for a peace treaty. The English held out for too much for too long, and Philip of Burgundy cut a deal with the French king, leaving the English to continue their hastening backpedal northwards. This is a far different story from what Shakespeare offers, as he has Joan telling Burgundy lies to stir his anger at the English. Of course she lies. What do you think she is, a saint? Shakespeare depicts Henry's coronation in Paris in 1430. Yes, the Dauphin Charles had already been crowned King of France in Reims, so yes, this new coronation doesn't count. Shakespeare places Talbot in attendance at the ceremony, even though he was a French prisoner at the time, and the 9-year-old King Henry, graciously chatting Talbot up, remarks, "When I was young, as I am not yet old, I do remember how my father said, 'A stouter champion never handled sword.'" Given that Henry V died when his son was only 8 months old, his recall of his father's words at the time makes his memory remarkable at the very least. There follows a scene in which division breaks out once again between York and Somerset, which Henry barely manages to tamp down. Act 4. Seeing all of this, Exeter profoundly gives perspective, placing his finger on the exact problems that are plaguing the English in this play. "'Tis much when scepters are in children's hands, but more when envy breeds unkind division. There comes ruin, there begins confusion." Sure would have been nice for Exeter to have given the benefit of such insight to the folks attending the coronation that day, but alas, Exeter never got that opportunity, having been dead 3 months already. This wisdom from the grave quickly comes true as York is given charge of the English wars in France, losing Paris in 1436. The English were losing hold of southern France, although, working with Talbot, York did manage to strengthen their grip on Normandy in north-central France, reaching a truce with the French in 1445. In 1447, Somerset took control of the English forces, now losing Rouen, for real this time, in 1449, followed by Harfleur, the northern outpost that Henry V had won some 30 years before. With the English hold on Normandy entirely dissolved, they also lost their grip on Bordeaux, a southwestern English territory dating back almost 300 years as part of the Angevin Empire. In one final grasp for control, Talbot marches south once again, recapturing ancient English strongholds, 20 years have flown by in the course of a single scene change since the king's coronation, and the mighty Talbot, now in his 70s, is fighting for the besieged city of Castillo. Shakespeare invents a situation in which both York and Somerset, in spite of the fact that this is all now enemy territory, are somehow within riding distance, as Talbot is attacked by French reinforcements. York refuses to attack without the horses that Somerset promised to send, and Somerset insists that it is too late now to send them. Each is more interested in pointing the finger to make the other look bad than in joining an ongoing battle. Unfortunately, Talbot's young son, young Talbot, had only just arrived in camp to join his father's forces, and, refusing to stain the family name by running away, dies heroically alongside his likewise dying father in 1453. Act 5. Shakespeare now jumps around in time even more. First, to the early 1440s, with Gloucester trying, unsuccessfully, to arrange a politically expedient French marriage for young King Henry. Then, further back to 1430, the Duke of York triumphantly captures Joan of Arc. She was actually captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English. Seemingly in that same battle, actually 14 years later, the 15-year-old daughter of the Duke of Anjou, Margaret, is captured by Suffolk, who falls in love with her, but being married already, pimps her out to King Henry, who, under the spell of Suffolk's description alone, falls in love with the girl. Her father, the Duke, was also the King of Naples, by title only, and rather than bringing money and lands to England, the English must give up lands in Anjou and Maine to Margaret's father, which is definitely not how dowries are supposed to work, and which will enrage several English lords in the next play. Shakespeare cannot finish this play off without taking down the one unstained hero France manages to put forward, and we find Joan of Arc on trial, repudiating her peasant father, declaring herself as a saintly virgin, but, threatened with burning at the stake, declares herself with child, proceeding to name 3 different men as the child's father, before being trundled off to her execution in 1431, some 23 years before the death of Talbot and 14 years before the arranged marriage to Margaret. The play ends with King Henry sending Suffolk off to retrieve his new bride Margaret, as Suffolk alone triumphs. Thus Suffolk hath prevailed, and thus he goes, as did the youthful Paris once to Greece. Just in case you're not familiar with Greek history, that whole episode of retrieving Helen of Troy perhaps did not go as well for the Greeks as Suffolk maybe thinks it did. Henry VI, Part 1, makes a hash of English history. Such a terrible hash that it was almost certainly written by another author, with the exceptions of brief passages, such as the red and white rose garden scene, or perhaps the capture of Margaret, that Shakespeare inserted to make it match up better with the 2 plays he was already planning, Henry VI Parts 2 and 3. As I said, this play is totally obsessed with one question: how could the English possibly lose to the French? The tail end of the 100 Years' War with France were rife with humiliating defeats for the English, especially in the aftermath of the previous great victories of Henry V in France, and especially in Agincourt. Of course, no Elizabethan English playwright is going to give you an honest representation of just how that war went, and so Shakespeare, whomever, is left jumping from castle to castle and from decade to decade to revel in whatever tiny victories he can stick a flag in to portray the French as cowards and Joan of Arc as a witch, and to blame all of England's failures on the infighting between English lords, rather than accept the fact that the French may have learned something after Agincourt and got their mangled together long enough to send the English packing. So this has been I Finally Get Henry VI Part 1. Thanks for joining me. I promise not to let it go quite so long before coming back with Henry VI Part 2, but in the meantime, please check out my videos on the first 5 history plays, King John, Richard II, Henry VI Parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. And for a limited time, my full performance of Shakespeare's Histories, 10 epic plays at a breakneck pace, is posted for your enjoyment for free at breakneckshakespeare.com, along with other great plays from the catalog. They're also available in book form. And finally, I hit the road touring the United States every fall and spring, and you can book me in person in your local school or theater via timmooney.rep.com. Thanks for watching. See you on the stage.